À la claire fontaine m'en allant promener, à la claire fontaine m'en allant promener, j'ai trouvé l'eau si belle que je m'y suis baigné. Lui, à longtemps que je t'aime, jamais je ne t'oublierai.
The Indians built their canoes from things of the forest. They built them of bark from the trees. Birch bark was strong and had natural gum that preserved it for long. In the eastern forests were many giant birches. They slit the bark down with a crooked knife, won in trade from the white men, whom they called gens de fer, people of iron. They pried it loose with a wedge of bark. This they did in June, when the sap was running and the bark was moist and loose on the tree. They called the bark wigwas. The craft has been handed down to the sons of Mat Bernard, an Algonquin chief who still knows the secret of building as the ancient Indians built. At their camp, Mat and Morris, his son, unrolled the bark, softening it with hot water poured from an iron pot. Such pots could be had from the traders at 1 beaver skin per pound of pot. Then Mat splits the sweet-smelling kijik, or cedar, to make a lining. He lays the strips of cedar on the bark to protect it during the building. The frame is made by tying together at each end 2 long strips of pliable wood, such as cedar or ash. They are tightly bound with thongs of peeled basswood bark. Cross pieces are fitted and tied into place. They lay this frame on the bark and anchor it in place with heavy stones. Then the canoe begins to take shape. They fold the ends up and hold them by a simple vise. They drive in stakes to hold the bark in shape. As they turn up the bark, they pour on hot water to keep it from splitting. A second strip of bark is slipped in to form the side of the craft. And then comes the longest task of all, a task that falls to the women, the sewing of seams in the bark. The sewing is done with watap, the stubborn spruce root pulled from the ground by the men. The tough fiber is carefully split. Mat follows the grain from side to side, making sure the division is even. Morris peels off the rough outer bark. After soaking in water, the watap is moist and soft for use. Holes are punched with a megas, or bone awl. Mat's wife is Algonquin. She learned the skills of her grandparents, who were Indians of the woods. With them she lived in and from the forest. All the women work at the sewing, for the seams are long. While the women sew, the men go on with the building. A piece of cedar is split into many prongs and bent to form the bow piece. Mat binds it with basswood bark and ties it in such a way that it holds its curve. Then he trims the bark at the prow. He does not leave it high enough to catch the wind and thus make steering difficult. He cuts it to a curve that will skim the water easily. A gunwale is made to fit the canoe and fastened on with wooden pegs. Spruce root is used again as a binding. The gunwale must be strong and the binding firm, for a half-dozen voyageurs will entrust their lives to the hands that built the canoe. Meanwhile, strips of cedar for the ribs have been put to soak in the river. The wet cedar is easily bent. Each one is fitted to its own place in the body of the canoe. In this shape they dry, and Nat whittles the ends to fit in under the gunwale. Out in the woods again, the women gather Minae gobigu, the thick gum that hardens in great drops on the trunk of the spruce tree. This will be used to make the seams watertight. First, the lumps of raw gum are placed in a bag and boiled in water. The bits of bark and dirt that cling to the gum are held in the bag, but the clear gum rises to the surface and is skimmed off with a birch bark spoon. The hot liquid gum is dropped into cold water and hardens immediately so that it can be pulled until every drop of water is gone and it turns to the color of wild honey. Again it is boiled over the fire, and this time tallow is added. It must be exactly the right amount to make the gum soft enough not to crack in the cold water and yet hard enough not to melt in the hot sun. At last the gum is ready for use and the seams are caulked on the inside with a simple brush made from the splayed end of an ashwood stick. The gum hardens on the seams, sealing the holes against the swift water. They line the canoe with cedar. It must be strong to keep the 2 tons of freight and the straining feet of the paddlers from pressing too hard against the bark and the root-sown seams. They drive the